Colonel Jack Brener, a 79-year-old veteran, boards a flight to see his grandson's recital, carefully choosing seat 17D for his hip injury. When flight attendant Melanie asks him to move to a cramped middle seat for a family, Jack complies despite pain, feeling dismissed. Unseen by Jack, passenger Ryan Ellison, a tech VP, notices the injustice and alerts the airline. As the plane taxis, Captain Alex Worth steps out, saluting Jack and exposing the error. What happens next? Will Jack's dignity be restored, or will this moment fade into the hum of the flight? This story of respect and redemption needs your voice. Have you witnessed quiet acts of kindness? Share below, like, subscribe, and share our channel to honor veterans like Colonel Brener. Your support amplifies stories of humanity and courage. Join us in celebrating those who serve. Thank you. Colonel Jack Brener, a man whose name carried the weight of decades of service, sat quietly in the aisle seat he had meticulously selected months in advance. At 79, his frame was no longer the lithe, battle-ready form of his youth, but it still bore the strength of a life forged in discipline and duty. His hip, scarred from a parachute jump gone wrong years ago, ached with a dull persistence that had become as familiar as an old friend. Seat 17D, in the extended comfort section, wasn't about luxury, it was about necessity. The extra legroom gave him a small reprieve from the pain that flared during long periods of sitting, a concession to a body that had carried him through wars and now bore the quiet marks of time. This flight wasn't just a trip across the country. It was a pilgrimage of sorts, a journey to honor a promise made to his late wife, Sarah, to always be there for their family. His grandson, a gifted pianist, was performing his final recital at Berkeley College of Music in Boston, and Jack's heart swelled with pride at the thought of witnessing this milestone. The anticipation had been building for months, a flicker of light in the steady rhythm of his retirement. Jack's life in the sun-baked hills of Santa Fe, New Mexico, was one of deliberate simplicity. The echoes of military commands had long faded, replaced by the soft hum of a life lived in service to others. He was a pillar in the local veteran community, attending meetings, offering guidance, and ensuring the sacrifices of his fellow servicemen and women were never forgotten. His home, once filled with Sarah's laughter and their shared dreams, now held a quieter kind of warmth. Her absence was a wound that had never fully healed, a tender ache that surfaced in the stillness of the night. Yet Jack had learned to carry it, not as a burden, but as a testament to their love. He filled his days with purpose, helping others, tending to his small garden, and cherishing the memories of a life well lived. His family, though scattered across the country, remained the anchor of his heart. This trip to Boston was more than a flight. It was a chance to see the legacy of his name carried forward in his grandson's talent. As he settled into his seat, Jack's gaze drifted to the window where the tarmac stretched out beneath a sky heavy with promise. His mind wandered to the past, to the comrades who had become brothers, to the battles that had shaped him, and to Sarah, whose smile still lingered in his memory. The thought of her filled him with a bittersweet joy, a reminder of the life they had built together and the promises he still kept. He imagined her sitting beside him, her hand resting lightly on his, her voice teasing him about his meticulous planning. The plane began to taxi, and Jack felt a quiet satisfaction, a sense that this moment, this journey, was a small act of honor, not just to his grandson, but to himself and the life he had lived. Then, a voice broke through his reverie. "Sir, I'll need you to move to seat 34E, the flight attendant said, her smile polite but firm, her tone carrying the weight of authority. "A family needs to sit together." Jack's heart sank, a flicker of frustration tightening his chest. He looked up at her, his weathered face calm but resolute. "This seat was chosen for medical reasons," he said, his voice steady, each word measured. He didn't elaborate, he didn't need to. The injury to his hip, a relic of his service, was a private burden, one he bore with the same dignity that had carried him through his military career. The flight attendant nodded, her expression softening slightly, but her resolve unshaken. "I understand, sir, but we need your cooperation." For a moment, Jack considered protesting. The seat wasn't just a number. It was a small act of self-preservation, a way to honor the limitations of his aging body without surrendering to them. But he saw the faces of the other passengers, the hum of the cabin, the unspoken expectation that he would comply. He swallowed his frustration, nodded, and rose slowly, his movements deliberate, each step a quiet negotiation with the pain in his hip. As he gathered his small bag and made his way to the back of the plane, no one spoke. No one applauded his sacrifice. The cabin was a sea of indifference, and Jack felt a pang of invisibility, a reminder that the world often moved on without pausing to acknowledge the quiet battles of men like him. He settled into seat 34E, a narrower space that pressed against his hip like an unwelcome guest. He adjusted himself as best he could, his hands resting on his knees, his gaze fixed on the seatback in front of him. There was no anger in his heart, only a quiet resignation, tempered by the discipline that had defined his life. He thought of his grandson, of the music that would soon fill a concert hall, and the pride he felt pushed back against the discomfort. This was just a moment, he told himself, a small inconvenience in a life built on far greater sacrifices. Then, the cockpit door opened. The captain stepped into the aisle, his presence commanding the attention of the cabin. He scanned the rows of passengers, his eyes sharp, searching. When they landed on Jack, now seated at the back, a flicker of recognition passed over his face. He walked with purpose, his steps steady, until he stood before the older man. The cabin fell silent, the hum of the engines a faint backdrop to the moment. The captain raised his hand in a crisp salute, his voice clear and steady. "Colonel Brener," he said, "on behalf of this airline and as a fellow veteran, we're making this right." Jack's breath caught in his chest. The gesture was unexpected, a spark of recognition in a world that often overlooked men like him. His eyes, still sharp beneath the lines of age, met the captain's, and for a moment he felt seen, not as an old man in a cramped seat, but as Colonel Jack Brener, a man who had served his country with honor. The captain's words carried a weight that went beyond the flight, beyond the inconvenience of a changed seat. They were a reminder that his sacrifices, his service, still mattered. The plane hadn't yet taken off, but something else had landed, a quiet, unspoken honor that settled over Jack like a warm blanket. He returned the salute, his hand steady despite the ache in his joints, and a small smile curved his lips. The cabin remained silent, but the air felt different now, charged with a respect that needed no words. Jack leaned back in his new seat, his heart lighter despite the discomfort. He thought of Sarah, of his grandson, of the promises he had kept and the ones he would continue to keep. This flight, this moment, was not just a journey to Boston. It was a testament to a life lived with purpose, a reminder that even in the quiet moments, honor could still find its way home. Jack Brener's life was a tapestry woven with threads of duty, sacrifice, and unspoken resilience. Yet it was slowly fading into the soft blur of history. At 72, he carried the weight of his past with quiet dignity, a man who had never sought the spotlight, never craved applause for the decades he'd spent serving his country. As he settled into the familiar hum of the airplane cabin, the rhythm of takeoff preparations wrapping around him like an old, comfortable blanket, Jack felt a sense of peace. This flight was just another journey, another chance to quietly support his family in the understated, steadfast way that defined him. He had no inkling that the events about to unfold would shine a light on his story, pulling it from the shadows and reminding him that his legacy still burned brightly in the hearts of others. The boarding process was nearly complete, the cabin alive with the subtle chaos of travel. Overhead bins snapped shut with dull thuds, a baby's soft cries floated from a few rows back, and the low buzz of murmured conversations filled the air. Jack sat comfortably in seat 17D, the aisle seat he'd carefully selected months ago when booking the flight. The extra legroom wasn't a luxury, it was a necessity. His hip, scarred from a training jump gone wrong decades earlier, ached with a persistence that time hadn't dulled. The injury was a silent companion, a reminder of the risks he'd taken without hesitation in his younger years. The aisle seat gave him the freedom to stand and stretch when the pain grew too sharp, a small concession to a body that had served him well but now demanded care. Jack wasn't one to complain or make demands. His movements were slow but deliberate, each action carrying the weight of a man who once commanded respect simply by stepping into a room. His hands, weathered but steady, rested calmly in his lap as he waited for the final boarding announcements, his mind drifting to the family waiting for him at the other end of this flight. Then a voice broke through his thoughts. "Excuse me, sir," it said, soft but purposeful. Jack turned his head to see a flight attendant standing beside him, her posture polished, her expression warm but practiced. She was in her late 30s, her hair neatly pulled back into a tidy bun, a crisp red scarf tied around her neck. Her badge read Melanie, and her smile was the kind honed by years of navigating crowded cabins and weary travelers. "Are you Mr. Brener?" she asked, her tone carrying a hint of deference. "Yes, I am," Jack replied, shifting slightly in his seat to meet her gaze. His voice was calm, steady, the kind that didn't need to rise to convey authority. He adjusted his posture, wincing faintly as his hip protested the movement, though he masked the discomfort with the ease of long practice. "Mr. Brener," Melanie continued, her smile unwavering, but her voice taking on a slightly more formal edge. "I hate to ask this, but we have a situation. There's a family, a mother with 2 small children, who were separated during booking. Your row is the only one in this section with enough space to accommodate all 3 of them sitting together." The request caught Jack off guard, like a gust of wind disrupting a still morning. He blinked, processing her words, his mind sifting through the implications. "You'd like me to move?" he asked, his tone even but laced with a quiet question, as if testing the weight of her request. Melanie nodded, her smile holding firm like a lifeline. "Yes, sir. If it's not too much trouble, it would really make a difference for them." Her words were polite, but there was a subtle urgency beneath them, a practiced nudge wrapped in courtesy. Jack sat up a little straighter, his hands tightening briefly on the arm of him as he considered her words. The aisle seat wasn't just a preference, it was a carefully chosen necessity. "I booked this seat specifically," he said, his voice calm but deliberate, each word chosen with care. "I've got a bad hip from an old jump injury. The aisle and the extra space in this row help me move without locking up. It's not about comfort, it's about managing pain." He wasn't angry, and his tone carried no trace of entitlement. It was a simple statement of fact, delivered with the clarity of someone who had spent years making decisions under pressure. Jack's eyes held Melanie's, steady and unyielding, not out of defiance but out of a quiet insistence on being understood. The injury wasn't just a physical limitation. It was a badge of his service, a reminder of the jumps he'd made, the risks he'd taken, the life he'd lived for others. To give up this seat felt like relinquishing a small piece of the control he'd fought to maintain over his aging body. Melanie's smile didn't waver, but her posture shifted ever so slightly, a subtle tightening of her shoulders as she glanced down at the tablet in her hands. When she looked back at Jack, her expression was still warm, but there was a new firmness in her voice. "I understand, sir, and I truly appreciate your service," she said, her words careful but pointed. "But airline policy prioritizes families, especially those with small children. We need to ensure they're seated together." The shift was subtle but unmistakable. This wasn't a request anymore. It was a directive, cloaked in kindness but heavy with expectation. Jack paused, his jaw tightening briefly as he absorbed the weight of her words. "Is there another aisle seat in this section?" he asked, his voice steady but searching, hoping for a compromise that would preserve his small measure of comfort. Melanie shook her head, her smile tinged with a hint of apology. "Unfortunately, all the other aisle seats in extended comfort are taken, and first class is full." "Where would you move me?" Jack asked, his brow furrowing slightly as he braced himself for the answer. "Seat 34E, she replied, her tone softening, as if to cushion the blow. "It's toward the back." Jack raised an eyebrow, his mind quickly mapping the layout of the plane. "That's a middle seat," he said, not accusingly, but with a quiet clarity that demanded acknowledgement. Melanie nodded, her expression apologetic but resolute. "Yes, sir, but we'd be happy to offer you a complimentary snack and beverage for your trouble, a soda and a bag of pretzels." And the offer hung in the air, a meager token for giving up a seat he'd chosen with purpose, a seat that wasn't about luxury, but about necessity. Jack's gaze drifted past Melanie, landing on the family a few rows back. The mother stood awkwardly in the aisle, her face etched with fatigue and worry, 2 small children clinging to her coat. Their tiny hands gripped the fabric tightly, their wide eyes darting around the unfamiliar chaos of the cabin. Jack could see the strain in her posture, the quiet desperation of a parent trying to hold everything together. His heart softened, but his mind churned with the reality of what moving would mean. The middle seat would trap him, hemmed in on both sides, his hips screaming with every minute of immobility. The thought alone sent a dull ache through his leg, a warning of the pain to come. "This isn't about comfort, young lady," he said, his voice low but firm, his eyes locking onto Melanie's. "It's about medical necessity." The words carrying the weight of his years, the quiet authority of a man who had faced far greater challenges than this, but still felt the sting of being asked to sacrifice something he'd earned. "I know, sir," Melanie said quickly, her tone softening further, but there was an edge of urgency now. "But the flight can't depart until this family is seated together. We're asking for your cooperation." The cabin had grown quieter, the hum of conversation fading as passengers in nearby rows turned their attention to the exchange, their eyes carefully averted but their ears attuned. Jack could feel the weight of their silent scrutiny, the unspoken pressure pressing in like a tide. It wasn't just Melanie's request, it was the expectation of the entire cabin, the invisible demand to do the right thing cloaked in the language of policy and procedure. His chest tightened, not with anger but with the familiar ache of duty, the same instinct that had driven him to lead men through chaos, to make decisions that weighed lives in the balance. He sighed, a slow, measured breath that carried the weight of resignation. His gaze drifted back to the family, the mother's tired eyes meeting his for a fleeting moment. In that glance, he saw a flicker of gratitude, but also a quiet plea, a hope that someone would ease the burden she carried. Jack's hands tightened on the armrests, his fingers pressing into the worn fabric as he wrestled with the decision. Duty had always been his compass, but this time it pulled him in two directions, toward the family's need and toward his own. Colonel Jack Brener rose from his seat with a measured slowness, his voice low but resolute as he murmured, "I'll move, but I want it noted." The words carried a quiet defiance, a protest etched in restraint. He wasn't relinquishing his medically necessary aisle seat out of eagerness or goodwill. He was yielding to avoid becoming the scapegoat for a flight delay, a burden he refused to shoulder. The decision gnawed at him, a bitter reminder that even in the mundane confines of an airplane cabin, his needs could be so easily dismissed. His hands moved with practiced precision, one gripping the armrest for support, the other steadying himself against the seat in front of him. Every motion was deliberate, a testament to a lifetime of masking pain. Decades on battlefields had taught him to conceal weakness, to carry on with dignity even when his body screamed in protest. But this wasn't a war zone. It was a cramped commercial flight, and yet the same instincts of stoic endurance guided him. His hip, already stiff from years of wear and injury, flared with a sharp, insistent ache as he turned to retrieve his carry-on from the overhead bin. Melanie, the flight attendant, hovered nearby, her offer of assistance polite but perfunctory. Jack declined with a curt nod, his pride refusing to let him surrender that small act of independence. If he could still carry his own bag, he would. Always had, always would. The other passengers' gazes prickled against his skin, some fleeting, some lingering too long before darting away in shame or indifference. Jack couldn't discern which, and part of him didn't care to. As he shuffled down the narrow aisle, the mother with her children offered a faint, apologetic smile, her eyes betraying a mix of gratitude and embarrassment. Jack returned a single nod, more reflex than warmth. She wasn't to blame, but fairness felt like a distant memory in this moment. The injustice of it simmered beneath his composed exterior, not anger, but a quiet, piercing resentment that he'd been asked to give up what he'd carefully arranged for, what he'd paid extra for from a pension stretched thin. Seat 34E awaited him, a cramped purgatory wedged between a man already sprawled possessively over the shared armrest and a young woman lost in the glow of her phone, earbuds sealing her off from the world. Neither acknowledged his arrival. Jack stowed his bag with the same meticulous care he'd once used to pack gear for missions, then lowered himself into the middle seat. His body resisted, a dull grimace flickering across his face as he settled into the unforgiving space. The seat was a cage, too tight, too rigid, offering no room to stretch or shift. His left hip, already inflamed from standing and walking, began to throb almost instantly, the pain radiating like a slow-burning fire down his lower back and into his thigh. It was a familiar ache, one that had shadowed him for years, creeping in like an uninvited guest until it dominated every thought. Breathing itself felt like a chore, each inhale a reminder of his body's betrayal. Jack clenched his jaw, silent. He'd endured worse, nights spent on frozen ground in hostile lands, hours of marching through pain that would have broken lesser men. But this was different. The physical discomfort was only part of it. The deeper wound was the knowledge that he'd been displaced not for some grand necessity, not for safety or an emergency, but because he was the easier target. To the airline, a quiet, limping veteran was less trouble to move than a frazzled mother or a disruptive child. The indignity of it stung in a way no battlefield injury ever had, a quiet erosion of his worth that settled heavily in his chest. He shifted slightly, seeking relief for his hip, but the seat offered no mercy. The man beside him, oblivious or uncaring, continued to dominate the armrest, his elbow encroaching on Jack's already limited space. The young woman scrolled through videos, her world reduced to the screen in her hands, utterly unaware of the man in pain beside her. No one on this flight knew the significance of seat 17D. No one understood that Jack had paid extra for that aisle seat, not out of luxury but out of necessity, a small but vital accommodation for a body worn down by service. That seat had been his lifeline, a way to stand, stretch, and breathe without drawing attention to his limitations. Now relegated to the back of the plane, he was just another passenger, folded into a space not built for men like him, forgotten before the wheels even left the ground. He exhaled slowly, letting the pain sink into his bones, a quiet surrender to the moment. He hadn't given up his seat for praise or gratitude, but to avoid a confrontation, to spare someone else the inconvenience, to keep the fragile peace of this crowded cabin. It was a sacrifice no one noticed. Quiet, invisible, expected. 3 rows ahead, in seat 16C, Ryan Ellison watched the scene unfold with a keen, analytical eye. In his early 30s, he carried the polished air of success, a tailored suit, a discreet designer watch, and the calm, measured gaze of someone who'd spent years honing the art of reading people and situations. As a senior VP of strategy at a rising Silicon Valley tech firm, Ryan was no stranger to high-stakes environments, but this moment struck a different chord. The quiet injustice of what he'd witnessed, the older man, clearly in discomfort, forced to give up his seat, settled uneasily in his gut. Ryan wasn't one to act on impulse, but the weight of the moment lingered, stirring a restlessness he couldn't quite shake. He leaned back in his seat, his mind turning over the scene, dissecting the unspoken dynamics, the flight attendants' practiced courtesy, the veterans' restrained dignity, the passengers' collective indifference. Something about it felt wrong, and Ryan's instincts, sharpened by years of navigating corporate battlegrounds, told him this was a moment that deserved more than silence. Ryan had always approached air travel with the precision of a mathematician. His choice of airline wasn't swayed by flashy ads or loyalty programs. It was about cold, hard data, speed, reliability, premium perks. Those were the metrics that mattered. But today, as he settled into his seat on Skybound Air's flight to Boston, something shifted inside him. It wasn't about legroom or complimentary drinks. It was about something no spreadsheet could capture: the quiet, undeniable weight of human dignity. He had boarded just before an older man, Colonel Jack Brener, whose presence caught Ryan's eye the moment he stepped onto the plane. Jack moved with a deliberate slowness, his limp pronounced but not exaggerated. Each step down the narrow aisle seemed to cost him something: energy, maybe pride, but he carried himself with a steadiness that spoke of resilience. Ryan noticed the way Jack eased into his seat, 17D, an aisle spot in extended comfort. The choice wasn't random. Jack's careful movements, the way he braced himself against the armrest, told a story of a body that had been through hell and come out the other side. Ryan didn't need to know the details to understand that kind of pain. It wasn't age, it was survival. Then came the flight attendant, Melanie, with her practiced smile and corporate cadence. Ryan's stomach twisted as he overheard the exchange. Her voice was low, polished, but the words cut like a dull knife. Jack needed that seat. Medically necessary, he explained, his voice calm but firm, recounting a hip injury tied to his years of service. Ryan caught fragments of the conversation. Policy, accommodate, family of three. Jack's composure never wavered, but Ryan saw the flicker of frustration in his eyes, the tightening of his jaw as he was asked to move to 34E, a middle seat buried in the back of economy. A snack voucher was offered, as if a bag of pretzels could make up for the indignity. Ryan watched Jack gather his things, his duffel bag adorned with faded ribbons that told of sacrifice and honor, and shuffled to the rear of the plane. No fuss, no scene, just quiet acceptance of a system that had failed him. Ryan's chest burned with a mix of anger and shame. He didn't know Jack's full story, but he knew enough. Those ribbons weren't just decorations. They were proof of a life spent serving others, a life that deserved better than being dismissed for convenience. Ryan wasn't one to meddle. His world was one of efficiency, of staying in his lane. But this wasn't about efficiency. This was about right and wrong. He pulled out his phone and opened the Skybound Air Elite Concierge app, a tool he usually reserved for last-minute rebookings or tracking lost luggage. Today, it would serve a different purpose. His fingers moved quickly, each tap fueled by a growing resolve. Passenger in 17D, now 34E, Colonel Jack Brener, U.S. Army retired, 79 years old. Mobility issues due to service-connected hip injury, forced to surrender medically necessary aisle seat in extended comfort to accommodate family of three. Offered only snack voucher. Clearly in discomfort. This is unacceptable. He hit send, the message zipping through the ether to some faceless operations team. But he wasn't done. After a brief pause, he typed again, his words sharper now. I'm seated in 16A, witnessed entire interaction, request immediate review, recommend notifying captain before departure. Passenger is a decorated veteran who deserves better. The app confirmed delivery with a soft ping. Someone, somewhere, maybe in a sterile airport command center, would see it. They might ignore it. They might pass it off. Or maybe, just maybe, someone would care enough to do something. Ryan glanced toward the back of the plane. Jack sat rigid in 34E, wedged between two passengers who seemed oblivious to his discomfort. His posture was stiff, his hands resting on his knees, knuckles white. There was no outburst, no plea for sympathy, just a man enduring what he shouldn't have to. Ryan's jaw clenched. He wasn't a hero. He didn't chase causes or wave flags. But he believed in decency, in doing what was right when no one else would. Sometimes that started with a single choice, to speak up when silence was easier. The cabin lights dimmed as the plane began its slow taxi across the tarmac. The hum of the engines filled the air, and the safety video played on the seatback screens, its cheerful narration ignored by most. Passengers adjusted their neck pillows, scrolled their phones, and settled in for the 5-hour flight to Boston. Everything seemed routine, predictable, but something was stirring beneath the surface. A soft chime broke the monotony, the kind of sound only crew members seemed to notice. Then, without warning, the cockpit door unlatched and swung open. Heads turned. Whispers rippled through the cabin. Even frequent flyers, accustomed to the monotony of air travel, looked up, startled. The cockpit door never opened during taxi. Not unless something was wrong. Was it a mechanical issue? A security threat? A medical emergency? The air grew thick with curiosity and unease. Captain Alex Worth stepped into the aisle and the cabin fell silent. He was a striking figure, tall and broad-shouldered, with the bearing of a man who had commanded more than just an aircraft. In his late 50s, with silver streaking his temples, he exuded a quiet authority that didn't demand attention. It simply claimed it. His navy blue pilot's uniform was immaculate, the 4 gold stripes on his shoulders gleaming under the overhead lights. His eyes, sharp and steady, scanned the rows methodically, row by row, passenger by passenger. There was no urgency in his movements, no hint of panic, but his presence carried weight. This wasn't routine. He wasn't here to make small talk or announce a delay. He was looking for someone. As his gaze moved toward the back of the plane, Ryan's pulse quickened. He didn't know what was coming, but he felt the weight of the moment. Something was about to change. And then, in row 34, Captain Worth's eyes locked onto Jack Brener. In the confines of the airplane cabin, Colonel Jack Brener sat rigid in the middle seat, his broad shoulders squared as if bracing for an invisible battle. His hands, weathered by years of service, lay folded tightly in his lap, fingers interlaced with a tension that spoke of both restraint and quiet pain. The hum of the plane's engines vibrated faintly beneath him, but it was the discomfort of his cramped position that gnawed at him most. His hip, scarred from a long-ago injury sustained in service, ached dully, a constant reminder of sacrifices made decades prior. Jack's face remained stoic, his jaw set, but inside a storm of emotions churned. Frustration at the airline's oversight, a flicker of humiliation at being relegated to this tight, unforgiving seat, and a deeper, quieter grief for the dignity he felt slipping away. He had chosen an aisle seat with extra legroom deliberately, not out of entitlement but necessity, his medical needs clearly communicated when he booked the flight. Yet here he was, squeezed between strangers, his body protesting with every subtle shift. Across the cabin, Captain Alex Worth moved with purpose down the narrow aisle, his polished shoes tapping softly against the carpet. His expression, moments ago neutral as he greeted passengers, had shifted when he caught sight of Jack. Recognition flickered in his eyes, not of Jack's face but of the weight he carried, the kind only a fellow veteran could sense. There was no hesitation in his steps, no theatrical flourish. Each movement was deliberate, driven by a quiet conviction that seemed to radiate from him. Alex's heart beat with a mix of resolve and quiet anger, not at Jack, but at the system that had failed him. As a captain and a veteran, he understood the unspoken code of honor that bound those who had served. To see it disregarded, even unintentionally, stirred something deep within him, a need to right a wrong before the plane even left the ground. The cabin seemed as still as Alex reached Jack's row. Passengers nearby paused, their attention drawn by the captain's purposeful halt. The young woman beside Jack, her earbuds dangling loosely now, lowered her phone, her curiosity piqued by the sudden shift in atmosphere. Even the man on Jack's other side, who had been engrossed in a magazine, glanced up, sensing something significant unfolding. The air felt charged, heavy with anticipation, as if the plane itself were holding its breath. Alex stood tall, his posture impeccable, and raised his right hand in a salute so sharp it seemed to cut through the hum of the cabin. It was not a gesture for show, but one born of deep respect, the kind only those who have worn a uniform could fully understand. Jack's breath caught, his eyes widening slightly as he processed the moment. For a fleeting second, he felt exposed, the weight of all eyes on him amplifying his unease. But then he saw the sincerity in Alex's gaze, and something shifted inside him. A spark of pride, long buried, flickered to life. "Colonel Jack Brener," Alex said, his voice calm but carrying the weight of authority. "Sir, I was just informed of what happened, and as a fellow veteran and captain of this flight, I'm here to tell you that this airline got it wrong." The words landed like stones in still water, rippling through the cabin. Jack blinked, his throat tightening. He hadn't expected this. Not the acknowledgement, not the respect. For a moment, he was back on the battlefield, where camaraderie and honor were lifelines. The captain's words weren't just an apology, they were a reclamation of something Jack hadn't realized he'd lost. "I'm not here to offer you a voucher or a hollow gesture," Alex continued, his tone steady but laced with a quiet intensity. "I'm here to restore the dignity that should never have been taken from you." His words hung in the air, and the passengers, now fully aware of the moment's gravity, remained silent. The young woman beside Jack felt a pang of guilt for her earlier indifference, her phone now forgotten in her lap. The man on Jack's other side shifted uncomfortably, his thoughts drifting to his own father, a veteran whose stories he'd only half listened to. Across the cabin, others felt the weight of the moment, some reflecting on their own encounters with bureaucracy, others simply moved by the quiet power of what they were witnessing. Jack met Alex's gaze, his eyes glistening but resolute. Slowly he raised his hand, returning the salute with a crispness that belied his years. It was slower than Alex's, his movements careful to mask the pain in his hip, but it carried the same unspoken bond, a shared understanding between two men of different generations, united by service. In that exchange, something intangible took flight, a restoration of honor that transcended the confines of the airplane. Alex turned to face the cabin, his voice rising just enough to carry without the aid of the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his tone firm yet measured. "This man seated here is Colonel Jack Brener. He served our country with honor, carrying burdens most of us will never comprehend. And today, on this very flight, we failed him." The words settled over the passengers like a gentle but unyielding weight. A woman midway down the aisle froze, her coffee cup hovering mid-sip, her eyes darting to Jack with newfound respect. A teenager across the row lowered his phone, his usual detachment replaced by curiosity and a twinge of awe. The cabin, moments ago buzzing with pre-flight chatter, was now a sanctuary of silence, each passenger absorbing the gravity of the captain's words. Alex continued, his voice unwavering. "Colonel Brener booked an aisle seat with extra legroom because of a service-related injury. He explained his medical needs, and instead of being honored, or even simply accommodated, he was moved to a cramped middle seat at the back of the plane." He paused, letting the injustice settle in the minds of those listening. Jack's face remained composed, but inside he felt a mix of gratitude and vulnerability. He hadn't wanted to be the center of attention, but Alex's words were like a balm, soothing the sting of being overlooked. "This wasn't just a mistake," Alex said, his voice steady but edged with conviction. "It was a lapse in judgment, a moment where policy trumped decency." Then formy tones shifted, commanding but not harsh. "Flight attendant Melanie, he called, turning slightly. Melanie, who had been hovering near the galley, froze at the sound of her name. Her professional smile vanished, replaced by a pale, strained expression as passengers turned to look at her. She felt a flush of embarrassment, her mind racing as she realized her role in the error. "Yes, Captain," she replied, softly, her voice barely audible. "You will personally escort Colonel Brener to seat 1C in first class," Alex instructed. "Immediately." Melanie hesitated, her eyes flickering with uncertainty. "But sir, 1C is currently—" "If someone is seated there," Alex interrupted, his tone leaving no room for argument, "you will ask for a volunteer. And if no one volunteers, you will explain that the captain of this aircraft is reallocating that seat to a man who's already paid far more than any of us ever will." His words were not cruel, but they carried the weight of command, and Melanie nodded silently, her cheeks flushed. Alex turned back to Jack. "Colonel, please gather your things. Let us restore what should never have been taken." Jack rose slowly, his hip protesting with every movement. The passengers in his row leaned back, giving him space, their faces a mix of respect and quiet empathy. The man beside him slid his legs aside, his earlier indifference replaced by a solemn nod. The young woman with the earbuds watched Jack with wide eyes and her heart stirred by the unexpected humanity of the moment. As Jack gathered his small carry-on, his movements deliberate to conceal his discomfort, the cabin remained silent. Melanie stepped forward, her demeanor professional but subdued, and gestured for Jack to follow her. The captain stood by, his gaze steady, a silent promise that this was more than a gesture. It was a commitment to right a wrong. For Jack, each step down the aisle felt like a reclamation, not just of a seat, but of a piece of himself he hadn't realized he'd been carrying like a wound. The plane hadn't yet taken off, but in that moment, something far greater had already soared, a recognition of sacrifice, a restoration of honor, and a quiet reminder that even in the smallest acts, humanity could prevail. As Jack Brener stepped into the narrow aisle of the airplane, the hum of conversation among passengers softened, replaced by a subtle shift in the air. Melanie, the flight attendant who had earlier insisted on protocol with a rigid edge to her voice, now moved toward him with a different demeanor. Her shoulders, once squared with authority, softened into a posture of deference, her eyes reflecting a quiet awakening. She didn't speak, but her gaze carried an apology, not the kind rehearsed for customer service, but one born from a sudden understanding of the man before her. Somewhere in the middle of the cabin, a single clap broke the stillness, sharp and deliberate. Then another followed, hesitant at first, like ripples spreading across a calm lake. It wasn't a grand gesture, no thunderous applause or standing ovation, but a quiet acknowledgement, a collective nod to something deeper than the moment itself. As Jack moved forward, passing the seat in first class he'd been asked to give up earlier, a request that had stung with the weight of disregard, a hush trailed him. It wasn't the awkward silence of discomfort or the tense quiet of fear. It was reverence, soft and unassuming, as if the passengers, strangers bound by the shared space of Flight 726, had glimpsed something rare at 30,000 feet. They hadn't just seen a policy corrected or a mistake undone. They had witnessed respect restored, a small but profound act that carried the weight of years. Jack's steps were measured, his limp barely noticeable now, not because the pain had vanished, but because the weight of being seen steadied him. His heart, which had tightened with frustration earlier, now beat with a quiet pride, a reminder that his sacrifices, etched into his body and soul, still held meaning. When the plane touched down in Boston, the landing was seamless, the wheels kissing the tarmac with barely a jolt. But the atmosphere in the cabin carried a heaviness that turbulence couldn't measure. It was the weight of reflection, of moments that linger beyond their fleeting existence. As passengers disembarked, their usual hurry replaced by a subdued rhythm, many cast fleeting glances toward the first-class cabin where Colonel Jack Brener sat. His face was calm, a mask of stoic composure, but his eyes held a flicker of something new. Not triumph, but a quiet reclamation. His posture had shifted during the flight, no longer hunched against the ache of old wounds or the sting of being overlooked. Now he sat upright, shoulders squared, as if he'd crossed a battlefield of memory and emerged with something long buried now held firmly in his grasp. At the gate, Jack was met not by a flustered gate agent or a trainee fumbling through protocol, but by a woman whose presence commanded attention. Her blazer was crisp, the gold badge glinting under the terminal lights, her nameplate reading Elizabeth, VP of Guest Experience. Her handshake was firm, her eyes steady as she addressed him. "Colonel Brener," she said, her voice carrying a sincerity that cut through the usual corporate polish. "On behalf of Skybound Air, I want to offer my deepest apologies. What happened on this flight was unacceptable, and we're taking it seriously." Jack nodded, his expression unreadable. He wasn't one to chase apologies or revel in gestures, but he could feel the authenticity in her words, the kind that didn't come from a script, but from a place of genuine accountability. Elizabeth handed him a small envelope, her fingers lingering for a moment as if to underscore the gesture. Inside was a full refund for his ticket and a voucher for 2 first-class tickets, valid anywhere, anytime, with no restrictions. "It would be our honor to have you and a family member fly with us again as our guests," she said. Jack accepted it with a quiet "thank you," his voice low but steady. His strength, as always, spoke louder than words. Behind the scenes, Skybound Air moved swiftly. Within 2 days, the incident was escalated to the highest levels of the company. An internal report was compiled, drawing not only from the formal complaint lodged by Ryan Ellison, the tech executive who'd watched the exchange from row 16, but also from the captain's detailed account and the quiet observations of other passengers who'd felt the ripple of the moment. The company issued an internal memo, followed by a public statement, reaffirming their commitment to honoring veterans and service members. A thorough review of their policies on veteran accommodations was launched, and staff retraining programs were fast-tracked, with a sharp focus on sensitivity toward passengers with visible and invisible scars. The lesson was clear. Honor wasn't reserved for ceremonies or grand gestures. It lived in the quiet choices made in crowded airplane aisles, in the dignity woven into everyday decisions. For Jack, the apology and the voucher didn't erase the sting of the earlier slight, but they stirred something within him, a reminder that even systems, often cold and impersonal, could be nudged toward remembrance by a single act of respect. It wasn't about erasing the past. It was about affirming that his service, his sacrifices, hadn't been forgotten. 2 days later, Jack sat in the grand concert hall at Berkeley College of Music, the air thick with anticipation. The lights were dim, casting a warm glow over the polished piano on stage. The audience sat in hushed reverence, their murmurs fading into silence. Jack was in the second row, close enough to see every detail. The gleam of the piano keys, the subtle movements of the performer's hands. His back was straight, his shoulders squared, and for the first time in years, the familiar stiffness in his body felt distant, almost absent. The first-class seat on the flight had helped, offering a rare moment of physical comfort. But it was more than that. It was the feeling of being seen, of having his service acknowledged not just by words, but by actions that carried weight. The limp that had defined so many of his steps didn't lead the way tonight. His presence did, steady and unyielding, a quiet testament to a life of service. As his grandson Nathan stepped onto the stage, the spotlight caught the faint curve of a smile on his face. He adjusted the piano bench with care, his movements deliberate, and glanced toward the second row. His eyes met Jack's, and in that fleeting moment, a silent understanding passed between them. Nathan's fingers hovered over the keys, poised to begin, and Jack felt a swell of pride, not just for the music about to fill the hall, but for the bond they shared, one that no flight or fleeting indignity could ever diminish. The auditorium grew hushed as Nathan leaned into the microphone, his voice steady but thick with emotion. "This final song," he said, pausing to let the words settle over the crowd, "is for someone who showed me what true strength is, not through loud declarations or grand gestures, but through the quiet way he lives his life. My hero, my Grandpa Jack." A gentle ripple of murmurs spread through the room, like a soft breeze stirring leaves. In the back row, Jack sat still, his weathered hands folded in his lap. His face didn't betray much, no wide smile or nod of acknowledgement, but his eyes shimmered with a quiet intensity, catching the stage lights. He hadn't come here expecting to be singled out, hadn't sought the spotlight. Yet here it was, finding him through the words of a boy he'd raised, a boy who saw in him something timeless and profound. Jack's chest tightened, not with pride, but with a deeper, more complicated feeling. He wasn't one for public displays, never had been. Decades of service had taught him to carry his burdens silently, to let his actions speak where words might falter. But as Nathan's fingers began to dance across the guitar strings, the music pulled Jack's mind elsewhere, to a memory that still felt as vivid as yesterday. He wasn't in the auditorium anymore. He was 30,000 feet in the air, squeezed into a narrow seat at the back of a commercial plane, his knees pressed against the tray table, his body stiff from hours of sitting. The hum of the engines had been a constant, but it was the silence around him that weighed heavier, the kind of silence that comes when you feel overlooked, diminished. He hadn't wanted special treatment on that flight. Colonel Jack Brener, retired, didn't carry his rank like a badge to flash at gate agents. He'd asked for a small courtesy, a seat that wouldn't aggravate the old injuries earned in service, the ones that still ached on long flights. But the airline's policy had been rigid, the gate agent's response clipped and impersonal. "Sorry, sir, nothing available unless you pay for an upgrade." The words had stung, not because of the money, but because of what they implied. That his decades of sacrifice, the years spent far from home, the scars both visible and hidden, could be reduced to a transaction. He'd nodded, said nothing, and taken his place in row 34, swallowing the quiet indignity. That was his way, stoic, uncomplaining. But inside the hurt lingered, a reminder that the world he'd fought for sometimes forgot those who'd built it. Then came the sound of boots on the carpeted aisle, deliberate and measured. Jack had glanced up, expecting a flight attendant with a drink cart. Instead, it was the captain, his uniform crisp, his face etched with purpose. Captain Worth didn't hesitate as he stopped beside Jack's seat. The plane seemed to hold its breath. With a salute so sharp it could have cut through steel, the captain spoke, his voice low but clear, carrying the weight of conviction. "Colonel Brener," he said, "it's an honor to have you on board. On behalf of this crew, I'd like to offer you my seat in first class. It's the least we can do." The words weren't rehearsed, not pulled from some corporate head handbook. They came from one veteran to another, a recognition that transcended rank or protocol. Jack had felt his throat tighten, his eyes burn. He'd wanted to protest, to say it wasn't necessary, but something in the captain's gaze stopped him. This wasn't charity. This was respect. As the captain led him to the front of the plane, Jack felt the eyes of other passengers on him. Some looked curious, others moved. A young woman in a business suit clapped softly, and soon the sound spread, a quiet wave of applause that wasn't loud but felt deafening in its sincerity. Jack kept his head high, but inside he was grappling with a flood of emotions, gratitude, relief, and something like vindication. He hadn't needed the bigger seat or the free meal that came with it. What he'd needed, what Captain Worth had given him, was the restoration of his dignity. In that moment, at 30,000 feet, one man's choice to step out of the cockpit and into a fleeting but pivotal encounter had made all the difference. Back in the auditorium, Nathan's song swelled, each note carrying the weight of his admiration for his grandfather. To Nathan, Jack wasn't just a veteran or a family patriarch. He was a living lesson in integrity, a man who'd faced countless trials without ever raising his voice to demand recognition. Nathan had grown up hearing the stories, not from Jack, who rarely spoke of his service, but from others who'd witnessed his quiet heroism. The story of the flight had become family legend, told and retold by Nathan's parents, not as a tale of triumph, but as a reminder of what character looks like when it matters most. As Nathan played, he poured his heart into the music, imagining his grandfather's stoicism, the way he'd carried himself through that moment on the plane, never letting the world see how deeply it had affected him. For Jack, the memory of that flight wasn't just about the captain's gesture. It was about what it revealed about the world. Systems fail, he thought. Policies with their fine print and rigid rules often fall short of humanity. That day, the airline's protocol had failed him, reducing a man who'd served his country to a line item on a seating chart. But Captain Worth had seen beyond the policy to the person. He'd stood up, not because he had to, but because he knew it was right. To Jack, that was the essence of respect, not a plaque or a speech, but a single deliberate act that said, "I see you, your life matters." In a world that often prized convenience over compassion, that moment had been a rare and powerful exception. Nathan's song reached its final chords, and the auditorium erupted in applause. Jack blinked, pulling himself back to the present. He felt the weight of the room's attention, the warmth of their admiration. But his thoughts lingered on Captain Worth. The captain hadn't acted for applause or social media likes. He'd done it because it was right, because character still held rank above all else. Jack glanced at Nathan, who was looking back at him from the stage, his eyes bright with pride. In that moment, Jack felt a quiet certainty. The lessons he'd lived by, the values he'd carried through war and peace, had taken root in the boy he loved. Nathan's song wasn't just a tribute, it was proof that respect, the kind that lives in action, could ripple forward, touching lives long after the moment had passed. This story, Jack thought, wasn't just about a seat on a plane. It was about how we honor those who've come before us, the ones who've built the world we take for granted. Veterans like him, neighbors who quietly serve their communities, parents who sacrifice without fanfare. They all deserved more than words. They deserved actions, small but deliberate, that showed their worth. In a society that sometimes rushed past its elders, that valued efficiency over empathy, Captain Worth's choice stood as a reminder. Respect isn't a policy. It's a person standing up when it counts. And as Nathan stepped off the stage, Jack felt a swell of hope that maybe, just maybe, the world still had room for people like that.